Hey guys, thank you so much for tuning in. I deeply appreciate it. If you could do me a huge favor and hit that like button, hit that subscription button, and give us a little push to where we need to go so I can continue making these podcasts. It would mean so much to me, and I look forward to hearing from you guys. Drop me a comment below. Let me know what you think, and on with the show. Also featured on Netflix, History, and the Discovery Channel.
That's correct. They've been keeping me busy. Yeah.
Have they really?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of funny because I look back and at the time the skyjacking, the D.B Cooper skyjacking took place, I was 5 years old, had just started kindergarten, a month and a half earlier. And I remember that first day of school. And it's kind of remarkable in retrospect to look back and think that during that period of my life as a child, obviously in kindergarten, that there was this guy who would eventually end up skyjacking a jet, later be known as D.B Cooper, that would have such a material impact on my life, just sort of inadvertently, here 52, 53 years later. But I suppose stranger things have happened.
Now, so for people that don't understand, I have a little bit jotted down here in my little notes here. So basically, this happened November 24th in 1971. Am I correct?
That is correct, yeah. Yeah, and which was Thanksgiving Eve, and I can just kind of give a quick synopsis for people who may not be familiar with the case.
Yeah, please do.
Basically, it was on that day, Wednesday, November 24th, 1971, Thanksgiving Eve, where a guy shows up at the ticket counter, Northwest Oregon Airlines ticket counter at the Portland International Airport, Portland, Oregon, and he plunks down a $20 bill and purchases a one-way ticket to Seattle. Typically, that would be a 36-minute flight. This is 1971. You do not have to provide identification. You don't have any kind of security to walk through. So the name he provided to the ticket agent was Dan Cooper. And shortly thereafter, he goes to the gate, boards the jet with the other passengers. There were 36 passengers on the flight, D.B. Cooper included. It was open seating, kind of like Southwest Airlines is today. You just grab whatever seat you want to grab. He grabbed a seat in the very back row of the jet, which was 18. The seat was 18E that he grabbed. The type of aircraft was a Boeing 727. The 727 is a unique airplane. You don't really see those flying around nowadays, but back then, it was hot off the press. It was a brand new, commercial airline jet. And what made it unique is it had these air stairs that would deploy from the back bottom of the jet. So if the jet happened to be at a smaller airport that didn't have, a loading platform or anything of that nature, the jet itself could deploy these air stairs from the back bottom of the fuselage, and passengers could board or disembark the jet using those air stairs.
Oh, so they could board just straight off the tarmac.
That's correct. And in this case, that's exactly what they did. There was some construction going on at Portland that day during that time. So the passengers were literally walked across the airfield there and boarded the jet via these air stairs in the back of the jet. So D.B. Cooper was one of the very last passengers to board, and fortunately for him, the very back row was open, so he took a seat in the very back row. As the jet was buttoned up and started to taxi toward the runway, he turned around and handed one of the flight attendants a note. It's a note that said that he had a bomb and he wanted the flight attendant to come and sit next to him, which she, of course, did. At that point, he opened up this attaché case that he had and that appeared to have a bomb inside, a few sticks of dynamite, that kind of thing, and said that the jet's being skyjacked. And this is literally just as the jet's rolling down the runway and lifts off from Portland. So one of the other flight attendants is made aware of the situation, calls up to the flight deck, to the pilots as they're departing the Portland area, informs them that the jet's being skyjacked. D.B. Cooper made several demands, which in effect amounted to he wants $200,000 in cash delivered to the airport in Seattle. He wants 4 parachutes delivered to the airport in Seattle. He wants a refuel truck ready to refuel the jet as soon as it lands. And he wants all of this stuff staged. He wants it all set up there in Seattle before he's willing to let the jet land. And he says, if everything's there when I land, then I'll let the passengers go. And he wants it all staged and ready by 5 p.m. The jet took off from Portland at 3 p.m. and he wanted it ready by 5 p.m. So obviously the jet got up to the Seattle region in about half an hour pretty quickly, and it kind of tooled around. This is a major, I mean, I think the seating capacity was about 100 passengers. So it's a full-on commercial airliner, but it was in a holding pattern while everything was being put together at the airport per D.B. Cooper's demands. Importantly, the passengers were never notified of what was taking place. The captain got on the loudspeaker and simply said, we're having some mechanical issues. We're going to burn off some of the fuel before we land. So they were unaware of what was going on this entire time. The authorities were a little late in getting everything put together, which was much to D.B. Cooper's consternation. He wanted things to move along quicker. But basically, everything was finally set up. D.B. Cooper let the jet land in Seattle. It landed about 5:40 p.m., so it was about 40 minutes late. The jet was pulled to a private part of the airport, Seattle Tacoma International Airport, SeaTac. He received the ransom and the parachutes. He let the passengers go. He let 2 of the 3 flight attendants go. The jet was refueled, and they were actually on the ground for a couple of hours. They were on the ground in Seattle much longer than Cooper wanted them to be on the ground. But eventually they were ready to take off again with just the 3 pilots, 1 flight attendant, and D.B. Cooper. So just 5 people on the jet. And he ordered the jet to fly to Mexico. Okay. And initially he said, I wanted to fly nonstop, don't want to stop anywhere in the United States. The pilots told him they simply couldn't fly that far nonstop. They'd have to refuel somewhere. They decided to refuel in Reno, Nevada. And it's important to note that when the jet took off from Seattle, he ordered the jet to fly in a certain configuration. In other words, he wanted the jet to not fly over 10,000 feet in altitude. He wanted the landing gear to remain down on while they were flying. He wanted the jet to remain unpressurized, all the lights off, and I think very tellingly, he wanted the flaps also deployed at a 15-degree flap setting. So it was a very drag-heavy, dirty configuration.
According to some of the things I've listened to and I've looked at, is it true that he wanted it kept at a certain speed as well?
No, there is nothing that indicates he wanted it at a certain speed. But by default, given the very dirty configuration, flying at 10,000 feet or what have you, as a practical matter, the jet really couldn't travel much over about 200 miles an hour. So the jet was flying about 200 miles an hour, which was a little bit above stall speed. So for somebody jumping out of an airplane skydiving, 200 miles an hour is a little bit faster than normal, but it's certainly not that big of a deal. It's not going to kill you or anything like that. Mm-hmm. But so the jet takes off for Seattle, or rather from Seattle. And very importantly, I should say that also that back air stairs door that I talked about that they boarded the jet in Portland, he actually wanted that to remain open on takeoff. So literally dragging on the runway at Seattle as the jet takes off.
I did not know that part.
The pilots refused. They said, we can't take off like that. That'll prevent the jet from rotating and everything else. So there was quite a bit of discussion back and forth. Ultimately, D.B. Cooper relented. He let the jet take off from Seattle with the air stairs up, but immediately thereafter, he lowered the air stairs. And it was about 36 minutes after taking off from Seattle, approximately 8:12, 8:13 p.m., as the jet was flying south and reapproaching the Portland area where it had come from a few hours earlier, that D.B. Cooper jumped from the jet, never to be seen or heard from again. And he had the $200,000 in cash with him. He took 2 of the parachutes with him. He took the bomb with him, what apparently was a bomb. And it's a complete enigma because at the end of the day, the authorities have never been able to determine who he really was, what his real name was. There's no photograph of the man. I mean, all we have is really just what happened during that several hours period of time. The media, I should say, immediately jumped onto this and started reporting the story. And
Right.
one of the reporters mistakenly heard the name D.B. Cooper and referred to the Skyjacker as D.B. Cooper, not Dan Cooper, as the gentleman had actually given his name.
It was a mistake on the media part.
That's correct. And they quickly realized, the media quickly realized, and the authorities realized, no, that's incorrect. The name is actually Dan Cooper. But I've said before, D.B. Cooper is just a more badass name than Dan Cooper. So it's just stuck for 53 years. He's forever been known as D.B. Cooper. And that's the story of D.B. Cooper. That's kind of where we are as far as that goes. Just literally a complete enigma. One caveat I should mention is 8 years after that, after the skyjacking in February of 1980, there was a boy along with his family, a then 8-year-old boy with his family, playing in the sand along the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington, or actually in Vancouver, Washington. And he happened to unearth 3 packets of old rotted $20 bills totaling $6,000 that were part of D.B. Cooper's ransom. And the reason we know that is because the serial numbers were recorded. So this is legitimately part of D.B. Cooper's ransom. So that is the only piece of evidence that's been found outside of the jet.
These were the tracked bills, correct? The ones that they had.
Yeah, the bills weren't really, I don't know if tracked is probably a little bit strong word. The bills weren't marked in any way. They just had recorded the serial numbers. So they were perfectly legitimate. American currency, could be spent. There's nothing wrong with the bills or anything of that nature. They just had the numbers recorded, but they were verified to be part of the ransom. So 6,000 of the 200,000 was recovered in 1980. Somehow mysteriously ended up there on the beach. The other 194,000 and everything else related to the case is really very much a mystery.
So based on that, what you had said on that family finding that money, the name Dick Briggs comes into play in the documentary and some of the things. What is your take on that situation?
I think it's just utter baloney. There's the Dick Briggs comes into the conversation in relation to a guy named Robert Rackstraw. Robert Rackstraw is a person who was a suspect briefly in the 1970s. The FBI looked into him and ultimately eliminated him for several legitimate, valid reasons. But there's one person in particular, a producer named Tom Colbert, who really latched onto this Robert Rackstraw story and has done a lot of work in terms of sort of adding to the story. And part of how he's added to the story relates to this Dick Briggs, who is apparently some sort of badass dude and involved in drugs and all that kind of stuff, is my understanding. But at the end of the day, Robert Rackstraw was not D.B. Cooper. That's pretty obvious. And it's not just Eric Ulis saying this. The witnesses, have said it's not the guy. So there's just nothing that ties him into Robert Rackstraw or anybody else in that orbit to the case. A side note, by the way, for those who may not know this, Tom Colbert, the producer, who's been really kind of the main thrust behind this and was prominently profiled in that Netflix show that you referenced. He's actually the brother of Stephen Colbert, the Stephen Colbert. So that's a little interesting side note there.
You learn something new every day, brother. Yeah. Now let's dive into you a little bit. Let's get your take on some things. How old were you when you decided to go deep into this whole DB Cooper? What drew you to it? Like, were you sitting there like, oh my God, like this has got to be one of the coolest freaking things that's ever happened? And you know what? I'm going to find this fucking guy.
That's pretty much it. I first heard of the case probably a couple of years before the money was found. I first kind of vaguely recall hearing of it about 1978, at which time I was 12 years of age. I'm now 58. So probably about 2008. So what is that? Maybe 16 years ago or so.
Okay.
I distinctly remember seeing something in the media about the Cooper case, and I kind of occasionally kept up on it, and as things would appear in the media. And for whatever reason, this thought just entered my mind, like, you know what? I bet you I could figure out who this guy was. Again, it's it's the modern day, modern science, modern technology. Let's see if I can figure out who it was. So I've said before, it started out as a guilty pleasure, just kind of a hobby, just something I'm interested in, like trying to figure out how to solve the Rubik's Cube kind of a thing, because it's just how my mind works. And it just morphed into something much bigger over the last 16 years or so. But it's been a hell of a ride. It's been a lot of fun. It's been very interesting. And I think we're actually very, very close to figuring out who this guy was when all is said and done.
I find it amazing. If you look back onto interviews that the news has spoken to, just the public in general, the public is like on DB's side. They're like, that man, he did it. He got away with it. He jumped out of a freaking plane. He got $200,000. The man is gone. He's somewheres, and it's just like, sticking it to the man, and he got away with it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. And I think that this played a part in no small reason of him actually getting away, because he was immediately viewed. D.B. Cooper was immediately viewed by the American public as sort of this anti-hero. And it's important to remember what was going on in America in 1971. It was 8 years earlier when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr., Robert F. Kennedy were assassinated, 5 years or so after JFK. You've got Vietnam taking place at this point. Kent State University, for those who are not familiar, feel free to go Google Kent State University and National Guard. This is related to some students getting shot and killed in the Vietnam protests. That was just a few months before this. And of course, the civil rights stuff. So this was a tumultuous time in American history. And basically, there are a hell of a lot of people that pretty much said, who gives a shit? Like, so some dude ripped off $200,000 from, in effect, an insurance company is going to have to make the airline whole. Who cares? There was this such a volatile time in American history that there were, as you noted, a lot of people that were just rooting for the guy to get away. They're like, that's kind of a cool, badass James Bond kind of a thing. And America sucks right now, so good on him, is basically how a lot of people looked at it.
So on his flight, so I guess you could say, heading to basically Mexico City, he jumps out at a certain point in between, what was it, Reno and somewheres in between?
He jumped very near Vancouver, Washington. Vancouver, Washington is just north of Portland, Oregon. So it was only about 36 minutes after the jet took off from Seattle. So once he jumped, first of all, the pilots weren't certain he had jumped, but it took another 2.5 hours or 2 hours or so of lumbering along at 200 miles an hour before the jet actually landed in Reno. And eventually the FBI boarded the jet and ascertained that D.B. Cooper is no longer there.
Now, the ground area in general where he jumped, what was it, a saturation of just forest, woods, different developments? I mean, can you give us an understanding of that?
Yeah, he jumped over Clark County, Washington. And Clark County is kind of a combination of some wooded forest stands and also open agricultural land, and then development, neighborhoods, and that kind of thing. So the area where he jumped, I believe, I think it's fair to say that most of it is open, sort of agricultural kind of land. So, and certainly if he landed in a field, that kind of thing, it would have been perfectly safe. Even if he had landed in a stand of pine trees or something like that, evergreens, it's not a big deal. He could have rappelled down and eventually gotten away. But there's a lot of people that live in that area, and within 24 hours, people immediately started looking around that area to try to find D.B. Cooper or some evidence that the man was ever there. And outside of the $6,000, which ironically was found about 20 miles from where they believe he landed. They found nothing at all. And this is really one of the mysteries within the mystery related to the case. I'm of the opinion that part of the reason they never found anything where they believed he jumped, and part of the reason the money or portion of it ended up 20 miles from where they believe he jumped, is because I think that the flight path that the authorities used was incorrect.
Oh, really?
I believe that very strongly, that the flight path is incorrect. Specifically, you had the airliner, the Skyjacked airliner, flying south, and you had a couple of military chase jets. Actually, there ended up being 3 military chase jets that were kind of in the vicinity in the area, tasked with putting together, constructing the flight path. About a day or so later, trying to figure out what the flight path was. And again, it's important to remember, this is 1971. This isn't 2024 where, we've got sort of GPS technology and you can just push a button and reproduce the flight path with pinpoint precision. I mean, this was crunching radar data from different stations and networks and using a slide rule trying to figure out where the jet went. And at the end of the day, I think the mistake that the U.S. Air Force made, and I believe they did make a mistake with it, is the data that they were using, the radar data they were using, I believe was from one of their chase jets and not the airliner itself. So I think that explains why ultimately the flight path is slightly askew a few miles. And that's all it takes. If you're 3 or 4 miles off, bingo, that's the difference between finding D.B. Cooper and not finding D.B. Cooper. So I think that's what happened there. I think D.B. Cooper at the end of the day actually jumped and landed very near where that $6,000 of ransom was found in 1980.
I personally, in my gut, I believe he's alive. I believe he got out of there. He had to have landed. There's no body. There's no other evidence to say he wasn't. And it's just, it's weird. Do you personally, in your mind, do you think he had some type of training to actually do what he did, to jump out of that plane?
Well, I will say that I am 100% certain that D.B. Cooper survived and walked away for some of the reasons, as you've noted there, and for some other reasons as well. Now, one would think that jumping out of a jet 10,000 feet up, 200 miles an hour, that somebody would need some sort of experience, parachuting experience, because that's a pretty ballsy thing to do. But here's an interesting fact. D.B. Cooper kind of started a craze. There were a lot of copycat skyjackers after D.B. Cooper who did the same exact thing. A Richard Floyd McCoy is a very famous, well-known example. He tried the same thing over Utah about 6 months later.
Is that the one that they arrested and they thought possibly he may have been D.B. Cooper?
That's correct. And he was eliminated as a suspect as well. But what's interesting is that when you look at the totality of the copycats that did the same thing that D.B. Cooper did, the majority of them had never jumped before, had never even put on a parachute before, yet every single one of them survived. So if you just look at the evidence, the actuarial evidence, the hard evidence related to the copycats, that indicates that D.B. Cooper did not need to have any experience. This may well have been just his first time. He may have been somebody who was just desperate enough for whatever reason, who thought, you know what, I'll put the parachute on, I'll go to the library and figure out what I need to pull, and that'll be it. Because at the end of the day, if he jumps out of the jet and pulls that ripcord, which is his only, once he jumps out of the jet, he's got one job, and that's just to pull that ripcord. If he pulls the ripcord, he survives. He lands safely, because the type of parachute that he jumped with was a military emergency rig, which is designed for pilots who are in a fighter jet that's about ready to crash, and you just push the button and you get ejected out of the cockpit. And those things will deploy and deliver you safely to the ground if you're traveling 500 miles an hour. So that thing is, they're not failing. So that's the thing, is that D.B. Cooper, he didn't need to be a rocket scientist, didn't need to be a CIA operative, a Green Beret, or anything of that nature. He just needed to be bright enough to realize he had to have the stones to do it, and he just had to pull that cord. Yeah. That's it. That's all was required, just like the copycats. And
4 parachutes, though. Why? Why do you think 4 parachutes?
Well, the 4 parachutes, what he asked for specifically were 2 front parachutes and 2 back parachutes. So in effect, he was asking for 2 complete sets of parachutes.
Gotcha.
Typically, the back parachute is the main parachute. The front is a reserve. It's a safety measure thing. The problem, however, is that the 2 parachutes, the back parachutes that were delivered, were both emergency rigs. And emergency rigs are not designed to be coupled with a reserve parachute in the front. Emergency rigs are for emergencies only, as I just noted. And if they don't work, you're fucked. You're just not going to live. So, but they always work. They always work. Yeah. So I believe that he did take one of the back parachutes, very durable, certainly capable of delivering him to the ground alive. And as noted, he also took one of the reserve parachutes. And I think that the reason he took one of the reserve parachutes was to hold some of the money, because he had requested that the money be delivered in a knapsack. And I think it's pretty clear that what he had in mind was, basically the money in a knapsack or a backpack. He was going to probably wear that backwards and jump, but they didn't deliver it like that. They actually delivered it in just a cheap white canvas bank bag, which D.B. Cooper was not happy with. And I think he unloaded or offloaded some of the money out of that bag, because it was about 20 pounds worth of cash. And I think he put part of the money into one of the reserves. And then he kept part of it in the bank bag. And I think that's how he jumped out. So he did take one of the reserves with him, but I don't believe it was for any additional measure of safety or what have you. I think it was actually to hold some of the cash.
So evidence-wise, what about, apparently he had a drink on the plane. He smoked cigarettes. Am I correct?
That's correct. He had a bourbon in 7-Up, which he spilled, actually. So he didn't drink much of it. And he smoked, I believe there were 8 cigarette butts that were collected. I believe D.B. Cooper smoked 7 cigarettes, and that the other cigarette was from one of the flight attendants who was sitting next to him, a woman named Tina Mucklow, because as they were sitting next to each other, D.B. Cooper offered her a cigarette, which she took. And she smoked a cigarette with D.B. Cooper. So it stands to reason that out of the 8 cigarettes, one of them would have been Tina's cigarette, and the other 7 were D.B. Cooper's. Now, they unfortunately, again, 1971 here, they unfortunately, when they were sent to Quantico, they were looking for fingerprints, trying to determine what brand and size of cigarettes and all that kind of stuff. And that was it. And then they destroyed the cigarettes. They didn't keep them. Of course, DNA testing, all that kind of stuff was, many, many years into the future. So they had, if they had known there was going to be a DNA testing in 40 years, then certainly would have kept them. But they just looked at them as junk at that point. Well, they're destroyed.
Well, the case in general is not closed. It's just sitting somewhere in a file. Am I correct?
Well, it's very interesting because the case actually was, quote unquote, administratively closed in July of 2016. Okay. Which mean basically that it was closed. They weren't doing anything with it. Now, if somebody found a bunch of ransom money, then they would obviously reopen it and look into it, reinvestigate it. Now, having said that, I actually discovered a new part of a new thing that may contain D.B. Cooper evidence, DNA specifically. And this pertains to a skinny black clip-on tie that D.B. Cooper left behind on the jet. I believe accidentally. It was retrieved in Reno. And there's a part of the tie that apparently nobody had ever noticed before, a little metal spindle, because it was a snap-on kind of clip-on tie. Okay. And I determined it may hold DNA. So what I did is I sued the FBI to get access to that. Last year I was denied access, and it was kind of a head scratcher. I couldn't really figure out why. But what ended up happening is the FBI ended up reactivating the case apparently for the purposes of testing that metal spindle of the tie themselves versus having a DNA expert that I, retained for those purposes. So the case was in effect reopened for apparently several months
Okay.
to do some looking into some DNA and comparing some original suspects, and I think ultimately eliminating suspects. But it looks like to me, from what I can tell, pardon me, that what they did is essentially didn't come across anybody that matched the DNA, a new DNA profile that I believe they procured, and that they basically reclosed the case. So I think that the case as it stands right now is basically in hibernation mode at this point. But they did briefly reopen it again within the last year.
Any new development or?
Well, I think that it's pretty clear that they tested the spindle, which is what I was suing to get access to, and that they came up with a new DNA profile, which is obviously very big news. And it's clear to me that they took that new DNA profile and they compared it against a group of 6, 7, 8 men that they had looked at in 2004. That they have never been able to completely, really comfortably eliminate. But it does appear that with this new DNA profile, they were able to finally eliminate all those suspects. And that's it. So they apparently have the new profile, which I imagine they could always pull out of their back pocket at any point in the future if there's a credible person of interest that comes on the radar screen. But outside of that, it's really, really difficult to see what's going on within the FBI. And having said that, I actually have partnered with a guy named Tom Kay. Tom Kay is a private citizen. He's a scientist. He was actually granted access to D.B. Cooper's tie while it was in FBI custody on 2 separate occasions, once in 2009, once in 2011. I think it was 2011. And he did some work on the tie, and he has a filter related to a small vacuum that he used to vacuum the tie with that does contain D.B. Cooper's DNA. That filter contains D.B. Cooper's DNA as well as DNA from FBI agents and others who came across that tie. So we're in the process of having that filter and that DNA, all that DNA analyzed with a very kind of a cutting edge type of ancient DNA analysis called metagenomic for the purposes of splicing it out. So irrespective of what the FBI is doing on the case with respect to DNA, I am working on getting my own DB Cooper DNA profile with Tom Kay. And so we're just going to pick up the torch once we've got that in our hand, which it's going to take several months. But once we've got that, then we'll be able to, I think, go even further than the FBI as far as trying to figure out who this guy actually was.
Let me ask you this, Eric. All the witnesses from the plane in general, were you able to reach out to anybody who could remember anything like that and just kind of get their story once again? Did it stay consistent? Did things change? Or
I think basically, like, there are a couple of critical witnesses. There was a gentleman named Bill Mitchell, who back in 1971 was a 20-year-old college student. He sat next to DB Cooper. He sat directly across the aisle from DB Cooper. There's nobody in between them. So I know Bill Mitchell quite well. I've talked with him many times about this. And, obviously he's been peppered with all kinds of questions over the years. Honestly, there's not much new that he's been able to provide in terms of any kind of recollections. The best source for that kind of information relates to the FBI 302s, or the forms that the FBI fills out when they interview a witness, from the night of the skyjacking and shortly thereafter. A contemporaneous recollection of events, what this guy was thinking, or what Bill Mitchell recalls 53 years ago, is of much greater importance to me than what he says now 53 years later, because people's memories fade and so forth.
Right.
I've also talked to one of the pilots, a gentleman named Bill Radicek, who's still around, quite old. So I have talked with several people who firsthand witnesses people that were directly involved with this thing, and air traffic controller who managed the jet. The captain of the flight was a gentleman named Captain William Scott. He passed away in 2007, but his daughter was 16 years of age at the time. I know her well. Her name's Catherine. So there's a lot of people that I know that I've managed to talk with over the years about this as I've conducted my own personal investigation. I have to say the main thrust of my investigation is really focused on that aforementioned clip-on tie, because that gentleman, Tom K., that I mentioned, did an analysis of the tie and tie particles that were on the tie, that came from the tie. And there are a lot of unique tie particles, metallic in nature, that came from the tie, primarily of some sort of titanium or titanium and alloys and things of that nature, which clearly appear to point to the aerospace sector. It appears that D.B. Cooper worked for an aerospace sector company. I believe actually specifically where he worked was a company called Remcrew Titanium in Pittsburgh, which was a supplier of specialty metals, titanium, stainless steel, to Boeing as a subcontractor during the 60s and into the 70s. So it appears that D.B. Cooper came from that universe, came from that world. Didn't work for D.B. Cooper does not appear to have worked for Boeing specifically, but worked for a major subcontractor. So all of this information is the byproduct of an enormous amount of investigative research on the tie and related to tie particles and so forth. And that's kind of where I live. I mean, I'm primarily interested in
the tie ties everything together.
What's that?
The tie ties everything together.
that it does. And, you know, it's the science. I mean, I'm a big fan of science and math and, you know, facts, things of that nature. Like I always say evidence doesn't lie. Evidence doesn't have an agenda. The evidence speaks to the truth. You know, it may be complicated and it may be kind of like a riddle. We're trying to figure out how it all works together, but the evidence is the truth of it all. And so, you know, stories are a dime a dozen. Evidence is a whole nother matter. So when we're dealing with, you know, with this D.B. Cooper investigation, we have very few items to work with that are of evidentiary value. And back in 1971, this skinny tie was of very little value. There's only so much they could learn from it. But, you know, fast forward 50 years with scanning electron microscopes and state-of-the-art technology and DNA and everything we have today, and it's a treasure trove. I think ultimately that ties the Holy Grail, and it's going to be D.B. Cooper's undoing is going to be that tie.
That's going to be the big one. My wife's theory is this. She says to me, you know, she's like, I think he paid everybody off on the plane and jumped out the freaking back of the plane. That's what he did. He paid everybody off and he got away scot-free. That was her theory.
I got to say, I don't subscribe to that theory.
Right.
But you know, there are a lot of theories out there. At the end of the day, I have to say I'm a believer in Occam's razor. Occam's razor essentially says the simplest explanation is usually the closest to the truth. And at the end of the day, I just think D.B. Cooper was, you know, a middle-aged guy, probably pretty well educated, was probably part of the depression that the aerospace sector was fighting through in 1971 at the time of the skyjacking. And I just think he was a guy who was jammed up financially, probably had a pink slip in hand, wasn't really certain what the future was going to hold for him. And for whatever reason, he just decided this was his ticket out. He's going to skyjack a jet. He's going to extort $200,000, and he's just going to be done with it. I do not believe D.B. Cooper was a career criminal. I think it was a one-off event. And I think part of the reason why, probably the main reason why he got away, is because he was very quiet about it. Didn't brag about it with his buddies at the bar. Didn't go out and buy a brand spanking new, you know, hot off the lot 1972 Cadillac or anything. I think he was very dialed back, very quiet about it, very meticulous about it. And I think that in essence speaks to how he got away and why he got away.
I thought about that myself, thinking maybe, you know, he was a part of something with the aerospace family. He was doing something had to have happened. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to get mine. This is how I'm going to do it. I'm going to plan it out and I can get away with it. And that's what he did.
Well, it's interesting too, because 11 days before the DB Cooper skyjacking, there was a gentleman named Paul Sinney who tried something remarkably similar in Canada and failed. But he tried to extort money from a bank, some banks up there, and tried to do this in Canada. He failed. He got caught. Didn't work out. But that was actually broadly reported in the media. And I think that I wouldn't be surprised. In fact, if I were a betting person, I'd say DB Cooper probably read about this Paul Sinney guy and his failed attempt to extort, whatever sum of money he was trying to extort from, I believe it was an Air Canada flight. And it probably planted a seed in DB Cooper's mind. It inspired him. He probably thought, you know what? It's actually not a bad idea, and I can actually make this thing work. I know how to do it better. And therefore, a couple of weeks later, he pulls off the skyjacking on Thanksgiving Eve, and sure enough, he managed to get away with it.
Well, prior to this, was there anything big like that had happened? Was there anything similar to some type of skyjacking where somebody literally, in the States?
No, nothing. I mean, there were a lot of skyjackings, typically the revolutionaries who want to go to Cuba type of thing.
Right.
But as far as what we're talking about here, where you extort, a load of money in exchange for the passengers and then jump out of an airliner mid-flight with a parachute, that was new. That was very innovative, really. I'm still blown away. Like, to this day, you sit back and you think about it. And you're like, oh man, that dude, man, he had some balls on him, man. He really, really did. Yeah, you're not kidding. I mean, I don't know if you've ever jumped from a plane before. I've jumped. I've been up, over Arizona here and 12,500 feet up. And I tell you what, when I open that door, to jump, that's a shit just got real kind of moment, So,
Right.
It's one of those things where that definitely took some stones to do that. Stones are, again, somebody who is just very, very desperate and probably supremely confident in his ability to pull it off successfully. Because Cooper reminds me, or he strikes me as somebody who is actually pretty sophisticated and pretty bright. I believe he was a well-educated person. Again, I believe he was a metallurgist, came from this specialty metals world, which are, these aren't stupid men. These are stupid people. These are bright people. So,
Right.
But, bright, successful people down on their luck, they're capable of doing crazy things too, like this. And I think at the end of the day, that's what happened here. So, in that sense, he was probably, a unique criminal.
It's a wild one, but to celebrate this, man, you also put on the Cooper Con. Am I correct?
Yeah, I have an annual event called Cooper Con that takes place in November every year. It's a 3-day event, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. It's about a week and a half before Thanksgiving. And this year, 2024, will be the 6th year of it. So it's been going on for a while now. Would have been the 7th year, except we missed 2020 because of the pandemic. Of course,
Yep.
Everything was shut down. But it's great because, we've got, a lot of, like, for example, this year we've got Bill Mitchell, the passenger who sat directly across the aisle, will be there. Catherine Scott, who is the daughter of the captain, is going to be there. Larry Carr, who is a former FBI special agent who headed the investigation, is going to be there, and a lot of other people connected to this case. And it's a lot of fun. I mean, it's just 3 days of a lot of fun. And I've yet to see a person after 5 years of doing these events that's ever walked out there and said, yeah, that sucked, or that wasn't cool. Like, it's not only a lot of fun, but it's really fascinating and entertaining. Hearing seeing some of the presentations related to some of the science, or hearing about some of the suspects and things of this nature. So it's just a lot of fun. It takes place in Seattle. And it's just a great time of year to do it. So yeah, this is the this is obviously will be the 53rd anniversary of the skyjacking in November. So yeah, 53 years. It's amazing. Having said that, I do believe that I'm on the record as saying by the time the 60th anniversary rolls around, I think we'll have figured out who this guy was. So it's just a matter of time that we put the pieces together.
Well, it's a big thing too. The anniversary of this jump, they do it up in Washington. Isn't there a specific bar or something that puts on where everybody comes out and hangs out and dresses up?
They used to have a bar near Ariel, Washington, and had a Cooper Days celebration. I believe, however, the last year of it was 2015. The owner of the bar, a woman named Donna, passed away that year. I believe it was 15, and that was the end of it basically. So CooperCon, my annual event, is really sort of taken over as far as that goes. And CooperCon's, it's been a phenomenal hit. I mean, it was prominently featured in that Netflix DB Cooper Are You was in episode 4 right up front. Every year we've got the media there with a ton of attention to what's going on and everything. So it's a very popular event, and there's an enormous amount of interest, not only in the media, but also, like I said, Hollywood has also been very interested. Joey McFarlane, Don Bershwell, who are top-notch producers with The Wolf of Wall Street, they're working on a DB Cooper related movie. They were there a few years ago.
Oh, nice.
So we've got a lot of a lot of kind of big name people that show up at this CooperCon every year. So it's kind of fascinating. It's interesting and eclectic all at once.
What other things that do you dive into that you look into mysterious, that you're trying to get answers to?
Well, one of the other big mysteries I spend a lot of time working on is the Gardner Museum Heist, which took place just over 34 years ago. 13 pieces of art stolen, right now worth somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion, the largest single property theft in United States history.
Wow.
I've looked into the JFK assassination related to which of the three Lee Harvey Oswald shots that were taken missed, because it's a little known fact that Lee Harvey Oswald shot 3 times at the president, and one of the bullets completely missed. 2 of them hit, one completely missed, and the one that missed has never been recovered. So which of the 3 shots missed has been somewhat of a mystery as well. I firmly believe it was the 3rd and final shot that missed. And that's significant for a number of historical reasons as well. But those are a couple of the things that I've spent a lot of time really looking into. And like I said, I'm a person who is not prone to buy into conspiracies or that kind of thing. It's just not the world I live in. I prefer to focus on the science and the evidence and the math and common sense, I would argue, those kind of things, to try to figure out what actually happened here.
Yeah, I did a little something, talk about that with another podcast guest, and we were talking about it and the angling of the shots and whatnot. It just the way that the doctors at the hospital talked, how it came in and came out, it couldn't have lined up properly, and things like that. I think the only way somebody knows something, but it'll never come out. It'll never come out.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, believe it or not, I think that the Warren Commission basically got it right. I do not believe there was a conspiracy in the case of JFK. I'm one of those rare people that thinks that basically Lee Harvey Oswald was a certified loser. There's a lot to back that up. He tried killing a guy named General Walker a few months before, killed Officer J.D. Tippit fleeing the scene of the crime, almost tried to kill another police officer in the Texas theater when he was caught. Guy who defected to the Soviet Union, then undefected to the Soviet Union, then tried to redefect to the Soviet Union, then tried to defect to Cuba. The guy was just basically just a certified loser. And I personally believe that it was just, history just sort of lined up in a sense where You know, he had his opportunity to make his mark on the world, and he did it, and he was successful. I don't believe there was any kind of conspiracy, but you know, that's a deep and complicated thing right there. But yeah, that's just kind of where I live, as I understand that case and as I've looked at it.
So you mentioned the possibility of a DB Cooper movie.
Yeah, there is a DB Cooper movie that's actually being worked on. And I know Rolling Stone did an article about it maybe a year or so ago, and it's with produced by Joey McFarlane and Don Berschweiler working on that. It's been kind of tight-lipped. Don't know much about it. It's going to really focus, I think, primarily on the primary flight attendant who sat next to DB Cooper for several hours and sort of negotiated this entire situation. That's my understanding. I don't know how accurate it's going to be or inaccurate it's going to be. I really have no idea. But you know, I imagine that will be out sometime within the next year or two. Obviously, they had the writer's strike several months ago. I don't know how that impacted things in Hollywood there with this movie, but did they come to you? Look forward to. No, nobody. I mean, I've communicated with them, but nobody ever approached me regarding that. You know, I mean, I'm probably the person to talk to for documentary stuff or unscripted programming, that kind of thing. You know, when you're dealing with, scripted, a drama, that type of thing, it's obvious that, you know, they probably have their own story to tell, basically. And I don't know that there's really much that I can really contribute in that respect. So
now the big question, what is your honest opinion on him? Do you know, your heart and soul, what tells you about DB Cooper?
Well, I think that he got away with it. I think that he was not a career criminal. I think it was a one-off event. And, you know, pretty sure he came from that Rem Crew Titanium, later known as Crucible Steel Company in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, no longer around. And, you know, I think that eventually, you know, we're going to figure out who this guy was, because I've said this before that, you know, time in this case serves as a double-edged sword. On one side of, you know, the equation, one side of the sword, you've got people that pass on and memories fade and evidence is lost and things of that nature happen. But on the other side, we have enhances in science and technology and new investigative techniques. And I think it's that second side of the sword that's ultimately going to win out. I think ultimately time is going to serve as our friend in this case. We're going to figure out who this guy was. And I think when he's finally revealed, finally uncovered, he's going to be a relatively nondescript, not a particularly sexy individual. He's just going to be a regular dude who basically pulled off the crime of the century.
So what's new with you? Do you have anything new coming up? Anything you're working on, looking forward to, like getting out in the open?
Well, I mean, I'm working on the DNA, as I mentioned before. That's a big thing. And, you know, working on with those tie particles. So there's always a lot of effort there as far as that's concerned. There's always a lot of conversations taking place about new documentaries and things related to the show and prospective series related to some parts of this whole mystery. So nothing I can really speak to too firmly at this point right now. We'll see what happens as far as that goes, but it's a pretty fluid situation. Things are moving very quickly. And I just encourage people to just hold on and enjoy the ride, because it's going to be a lot of fun.
Believe in the science, baby. Believe in the science.
That's exactly it. Yes.
Well, Eric, I wanted to thank you so much for jumping on today with me and for chatting about the DB Cooper and all that stuff. And, you know, it's just fascinating that this man did this and he got away, and the way the public views him as like a god in some sense, like, you know, give it to, you know, he sticks it to the man, he gets away with it. And, you know, but like you said, you're going to have those skeptics out there. Oh, he died. He's stuck in a tree. He's this, he's that, you know, but I don't know. I think the man got away with it free and clear. And and did some good for himself.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think that's, at the end of the day, I think that's basically what happened. You're exactly right.
I will actually, in the description for the podcast, I'll have all your links, and I'll put a link up. Is your book available on Amazon?
It's not available right now. It's being dramatically updated. I mean, it was originally available, but there's so much stuff happening so fast here that I've pulled it back because it's just being updated literally as we speak. And once I have a better idea of sort of the how some of these things come out, investigatively speaking, they'll be incorporated into the book and re-released. So I would expect that sometime near the end of this year.
So give the dates again one last time on CooperCon.
Yeah, CooperCon's November 15th through 17th, 2024 in Seattle. Anybody wants to learn more about it, you can either just Google CooperCon or go to the website, which is cooperconevents.com, cooperconevents.com, and all the information's there.
Awesome. Eric, thanks so much, brother, for coming on and hanging out and shooting the shit. I deeply appreciate it.
My pleasure, anytime.